The line at the bank moved slowly that morning, the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead blending with the shuffling of papers and the dull chatter of customers waiting their turn. Maria clutched her purse close to her chest, her fingers curled tightly around a crumpled check she had held onto all week. It was her lifeline, just enough money to cover rent, groceries, and maybe a little left over for her son's school supplies. She had learned to stretch every dollar, but this month, the numbers were tighter than ever. She stepped forward cautiously, her worn shoes squeaking against the polished tile floor. Her stomach knotted as she reached the counter where the branch manager stood. He was tall, dressed sharply in a dark suit, with an air of practiced superiority. His hair was slicked back, his gold watch glinting beneath the harsh lights as he tapped his pen impatiently on the desk. He glanced at Maria only briefly, his eyes flicking toward her like she was another inconvenience rather than a customer. Maria slid the check across the counter, her voice quiet. I need to make sure this clears. My rent is due today. The manager smirked, looking down at the check as though it were beneath him. He leaned back slightly, folding his arms, and let out a short, dismissive laugh. "Ma'am," he said, his tone dripping with condescension, "if you're this worried about whether your account even has a balance, maybe you should reconsider banking here. We're not a charity." The words hit Maria like a slap. Heat rose to her face, her chest tightening as humiliation coursed through her. She could feel the eyes of other customers on her, some staring in sympathy, others averting their gaze to avoid her embarrassment. She opened her mouth to defend herself, but no words came. She thought of her son, of how hard she worked cleaning houses in the mornings and stocking shelves at night, all to keep him fed and safe. And now, here she was, being mocked for daring to struggle. The silence stretched. The manager's smug grin grew as he seemed to revel in her discomfort. "It's simple," he said, his voice loud enough for others to hear. "If you can't maintain a decent balance, maybe this isn't the place for you." Before Maria could gather the courage to respond, a calm, steady voice broke through the tension. "I'll pay you double if you have a balance." The room shifted, heads turned. The words had come from a man standing a few places back in line. He stepped forward now, not with arrogance but with quiet confidence. He was dressed in a plain gray suit, nothing flashy, his tie slightly loosened as though he'd come from a long morning of work. His dark eyes held a softness, but there was also a firmness in his tone that silenced the murmurs spreading through the lobby. Maria blinked, stunned. The manager, on the other hand, threw his head back and laughed. The sound was sharp and dismissive, echoing against the marble walls. "You'll pay double, for her." He gestured toward Maria with a scoff. "And who exactly are you to make that kind of promise?" The man didn't flinch. He simply smiled, his expression unreadable. "Just someone who believes in keeping his word." The manager sneered, shaking his head as though the whole interaction were a joke for his amusement. He tapped the counter with his pen again, glancing between Maria and the stranger as if waiting for one of them to back down. The customers, however, leaned in closer, drawn to the quiet strength radiating from the man who had spoken. Maria's lips parted, but she couldn't find her voice. She had never seen anyone stand up for her like that, especially not in public, especially not against someone with authority. Her chest ached with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. She wanted to tell the man thank you, to tell him he didn't need to do this for her. But something about the way he held himself told her he wasn't doing it out of pity. He was doing it because it was right. The manager waved dismissively, his laughter fading into a scoff. "Let's not waste any more time. Step aside, ma'am. We'll deal with this nonsense later." But Maria didn't move. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she wasn't standing alone. The stranger gave her a reassuring nod, and she felt her shoulders straighten just slightly under the weight of his silent encouragement. The line behind them had fallen quiet, the usual irritation of waiting replaced by curiosity. Something significant was unfolding, though no one knew exactly what. All they knew was that a woman who had been humiliated a moment ago was no longer alone, and a man with an air of quiet authority had challenged the cruelty they'd all just witnessed. Maria's heart pounded as she clutched her purse tighter. She didn't know who this man was, but in that instant, his words had planted something inside her. A flicker of hope, a reminder that dignity wasn't only for the wealthy or the powerful. Sometimes, Dignity came from the kindness of a stranger willing to stand up and say, "You matter." And though the manager laughed and the tension lingered in the air, no one could shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much larger. The next morning, the bank lobby buzzed with its usual rhythm. Customers lined up, pens scratching across forms, the click of keyboards as tellers processed transactions. The branch manager stood behind the counter, sipping his coffee with an air of self-importance. Yesterday's little incident with that poor woman and the ridiculous man who claimed he'd pay double for her balance still lingered in his mind. He chuckled to himself, shaking his head. People like that always amused him, so desperate, so naive. He prided himself on being the one in control, the gatekeeper of who belonged in his bank and who didn't. But today was different. Something in the air felt off. It started with the sudden buzz of voices outside, the crunch of tires against the curb. A sleek black car, polished to perfection, pulled up directly in front of the bank's glass doors. Customers craned their necks, curiosity sparking in their eyes. Then came the flash of cameras. Reporters, actual reporters, were gathering on the sidewalk. The manager frowned, confused. Why would press be here? This wasn't some flagship branch in a major city. This was just a suburban bank, his domain, his little kingdom. The doors swung open, and the room fell silent. The man from yesterday stepped inside. He looked exactly the same as before, calm, composed, in a simple gray suit. But this time, he wasn't just another customer. He was flanked by aides and associates, people whose presence alone carried weight. A hush fell over the lobby as whispers rippled through the crowd. Customers leaned toward one another, employees froze mid-task. The manager straightened quickly, setting down his coffee cup, his chest puffing out. "What's the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice trying to carry authority though it trembled faintly at the edges. One of the aides stepped forward and spoke with crisp clarity. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. David Harrington, Chief Executive Officer of this institution." The words crashed into the room like a wave. Gasps filled the air. The customers shifted in awe, some pulling out their phones, others whispering his name as if it carried a myth. The bank tellers exchanged wide-eyed looks. And the manager, his face drained of all color. His laughter from yesterday echoed back in his mind like a cruel taunt turned against him. The man he had mocked, the one he dismissed as nobody, was in fact the very head of the entire bank. David Harrington walked forward with quiet authority, his gaze scanning the room, not in judgment but in recognition. He stopped in front of the counter where the manager stood frozen, his arrogance stripped away. The silence was heavy, every pair of eyes locked on them. But David didn't address the manager first. Instead, he turned toward the corner of the lobby, where Maria stood nervously, clutching her purse. She had come back, unsure if yesterday's strange moment would mean anything at all. She had debated whether to step inside, fearing humiliation again. Yet here she was, and now, the CEO himself was walking directly toward her. David smiled warmly, offering his hand. "Maria, isn't it? Thank you for trusting us with your balance." Her lips parted in shock. You remember my name," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Of course," he said, his tone steady and genuine. "Because people like you are the reason banks exist. We're not here for show. We're here to serve, and I meant what I said yesterday. If you have a balance, I'll pay you double." He reached into his jacket and handed her a certified check. Her hands trembled as she took it, her eyes filling with tears as she read the numbers printed there. It wasn't just money. It was validation, it was dignity, it was a reminder that her worth was not defined by a sneer at a counter. The lobby erupted in soft murmurs of astonishment. A few people clapped, others simply watched, deeply moved. Maria covered her mouth with her free hand, overwhelmed. I don't know what to say," she stammered. "You don't have to say anything," David replied gently. "Just know this, your balance isn't measured by what's in your account. It's measured by the sacrifices you make, the love you give, the resilience you show. And by those standards, you're wealthier than most people I know." Maria's tears spilled freely now. She nodded, unable to speak, her heart swelling with gratitude. David finally turned back to the manager, whose face was still pale, his posture wilted. "Yesterday," David said, his voice firm but calm, "you mocked a customer for being vulnerable. You laughed at someone for daring to struggle. That's not banking. That's cruelty. And in this bank, there is no room for that. The manager opened his mouth, stammering, "Sir, I didn't know who you were." "That's the problem," David interrupted, his words sharp but measured. "Kindness shouldn't depend on who someone is. Titles, suits, or salaries, none of that should matter. What matters is how you treat the person in front of you." The room held its breath. The message wasn't just for the manager. It was for everyone: customers, employees, anyone who had ever forgotten that humanity comes before hierarchy. David stepped back slightly, his gaze sweeping across the room once more. "We're going to do better. Starting today." The reporters scribbled notes furiously, cameras flashing as they captured the moment. But for Maria, all of it blurred around her. She stood clutching the check, tears still wet on her cheeks, her heart beating with renewed hope. Yesterday, she had been humiliated. Today, she was honored. And the man who had stood up for her had revealed himself not just as a stranger, but as someone with the power to make real change. As David prepared to leave, he gave her a final nod, his eyes warm. "Take care of yourself, Maria. And take care of that little boy of yours. He's lucky to have you." Her breath caught. She hadn't told him about her son. But somehow, he had seen her more clearly than anyone else ever had. The black car doors closed behind him, and as it drove away, the lobby remained hushed. Customers looked at Maria differently now, not with pity, but with respect. Employees glanced at the manager with thinly veiled disdain. And Maria stood in the center of it all, holding on to the proof that sometimes life has a way of turning humiliation into honor overnight. For her, the lesson was unforgettable. True wealth is never counted in numbers. It is found in compassion, in dignity, and in the quiet courage of those who choose kindness when no one else does.